So let's talk about sleep. Sleep is this incredible period of our lives where we are not conscious. We might dream, we might twitch, we might even wake up. But in sleep, we are only in relation to things that are happening within our brain and body. Outside sensory experience, in most cases, can't really impact us. And yet sleep is this tremendously important period of life because it resets our ability to be focused, alert, and emotionally stable in the wakeful period. So we can't really talk about wakefulness, focus, motivation, mood, well-being without thinking about sleep. And that's why we're devoting this entire month to the discussion about sleep. But we also can't talk about sleep and think about sleep without thinking about wakefulness, because it turns out that the period that we call sleep and the period we call wakefulness are tethered to one another. What we do in the waking state determines when we fall asleep, how quickly we fall asleep, whether or not we stay asleep, and how we feel when we wake up the next day. And today we're going to talk mostly about how to get better at sleeping. And the reason for starting the conversation that way, as opposed to just diving into a lot of biology about sleep, is because, first of all, there's a lot of information out there already about the biology of sleep. We're going to touch on a little bit of this, things like stages of sleep and sleep spindles, melatonin, and dreaming. But I think that by now, most people are aware that getting a really good night's sleep on a consistent basis is critically important. But most people don't know how to do that. In fact, I'm guessing that very few of you out there are consistently getting 7 to 9 hours of really terrific sleep, waking up feeling rested, like you're ready to attack the day, and being able to go through the day feeling focused and alert without dips in energy or focus. So if you're like most people, which includes me, you have some challenges with sleep, at least every third or fifth night or so, and maybe even more often. So we're really going to go tool heavy today and talk about tools that can help you fall asleep, sleep better, and emerge from sleep feeling more rested. And we're going to do that by grounding our discussion of tools in peer-reviewed studies, mostly from the last 10 years, although some even more recent than that. And we're going to start by discussing what is sleep and what governs the timing of the onset of sleep. In other words, what makes you get sleepy at a particular time of day? So what determines how well we sleep and the quality of our wakeful state? Turns out that's governed by two forces. The first force is a chemical force. It's called adenosine. Adenosine is a molecule in our nervous system and body that builds up the longer we are awake. So if you've just slept for 8 or 9 or 10 really deep restful hours, adenosine is going to be very low in your brain and body. If, however, you've been awake for 10, 15 or more hours, adenosine levels are going to be much higher. Adenosine creates a sort of sleep drive or a sleep hunger. And actually, hunger is the appropriate word here, because for most of what we're going to discuss today, we can think of it in an analogous way to nutrition. Your nutrition and how well you feel after you eat certain foods, your overall level of fitness and your cellular health and your heart health isn't governed by any one food item that you might eat or not eat. It's governed by a number of different factors: how often you eat, how much you eat, which items you eat, etc., and what works best for you. In the same way, your sleep and your wakefulness are the product of kind of the average of a number of different behaviors. How long you've been awake is a key one because of this molecule adenosine. So the reason you get sleepy when you've been up for a while is because adenosine is creeping up steadily the longer you've been awake. And a good way to remember this and think about adenosine is to think about caffeine. Caffeine, for most people, except a very small percentage of people, wakes them up. It makes them feel more alert. In fact, some people are so sensitive to caffeine that they feel jittery if they drink it even in small amounts. Other people can drink large amounts of caffeine and not feel jittery at all. Caffeine acts as an adenosine antagonist. What that means is that when you ingest caffeine, whether or not it's coffee or soda or tea or in any other form, it binds to the adenosine receptor. It sort of parks there, just like a car would park in a given parking slot. And therefore, adenosine can't park in that slot. Now, when caffeine parks in the adenosine receptor slot, nothing really happens downstream of that receptor. The receptor can't engage the normal cellular functions of making that cell and you feel sleepy. So the reason caffeine wakes you up is because it blocks the sleepiness receptor. It blocks the sleepy signal. And this is why when that caffeine wears off, adenosine will bind to that receptor, sometimes with even greater what we call affinity, and you feel the crash. You feel especially tired. Now, I'm not here to demonize caffeine. I love caffeine. I drink it in the morning and I drink it in the afternoon. But I'm one of these people that either because of my tolerance or because of some genetic variations that exist among people in terms of their adenosine receptors, I can drink caffeine as late as 4 or 5 p.m. in the evening and still fall asleep just fine. Some people can't have any caffeine at all or can't have any caffeine past 11 a.m. or else their sleep is totally disrupted. All of this has to do with the relationship between adenosine and these adenosine receptors, genetic variation, things that are very hard to find out except experimentally, meaning each of you needs to decide and figure out for yourselves whether or not you can tolerate caffeine and at what times of day you can tolerate caffeine in order to still fall asleep easily and get good sleep. So rather than demonize caffeine or say that, everyone can drink caffeine until late, you need to figure out what's right for you. Caffeine has a lot of health benefits. It also, for some people, can be problematic for health. It can raise blood pressure, etc. Caffeine increases this molecule that's a neuromodulator that we call dopamine. We discussed this in episode 1, which tends to make us feel good, motivated, and give us energy. Because, as you may have learned in episode 1, dopamine is related to another neuromodulator called epinephrine, which gives us energy. In fact, epinephrine is made from dopamine. So let's just take a step back and think about what we're talking about when we're talking about sleepiness. Sleepiness is driven by increases in adenosine that happen naturally. Caffeine prevents the adenosine from having its action of making us sleepy by blocking that receptor. So it gives us energy and it increases our dopamine levels. But some people can't tolerate caffeine very well. Other people can tolerate it just fine. So you need to determine that experimentally. All the data say there's tremendous variation. And right now, the only way that I'm aware of for you to decide whether or not caffeine is a good or a bad thing for you and whether or not you should ingest it at a given time of day or at all is really to figure that out on your own. In fact, there's a small subset of people that can drink caffeine until very late and they have no trouble falling asleep because they actually have a mutant form of the adenosine receptor. So in keeping with the theme of science and science-related tools, this is one of those cases where I can't give you a one-size-fits-all prescription, except to say you need to experiment with caffeine in a way that's safe for you and explore that and figure out what works for you and then stick with that. Okay, so adenosine is driving the sleep hunger. When adenosine is low, it's like we're well-fed, we're not very hungry. And when adenosine is high, it's like we're fasted for a long time and we tend to be very hungry. So that when adenosine is high, we really want to fall asleep. If you want, I'm not suggesting you do this experiment, but you can do it. You can stay up for 4 more hours than you're used to staying up, and you'll find that you're very, very sleepy. That's because adenosine is building up at levels higher and higher because you've been awake for those extra 4 hours. However, if you've ever pulled an all-nighter, you'll notice something interesting. As morning rolls around, you'll suddenly feel an increase in your energy and alertness again, even though adenosine has been building up for the entire night. Why is that? The reason that is because there's a second force which is governing when you sleep and when you're awake. And that force is a so-called circadian force. Circadian means about a day or about 24 hours. And inside all of us is a clock that exists in your brain and my brain and the brain of every animal that we're aware of that determines when we want to be sleepy and when we want to be awake. Just think about it. We don't go through the day wanting to fall asleep every 30 minutes and then feeling like we're wide awake. Our sleep and our period of sleepiness tends to be condensed into one block, typically one 6 to 10 hour block, although there's also variation in terms of how much people want to sleep. And we're going to discuss how you can diagnose your absolute sleep need, as well as how to recover sleep that you've lost. That block of sleep and when it falls within each 24-hour cycle is governed by a number of different things. But the most powerful thing that's governing when you want to be asleep and when you want to be awake is light. And in particular, it's governed by sunlight. Now, I can't emphasize enough how important and how actionable this relationship is between light and when you want to sleep.